a zone that humans don't survive in.
It is an elite program. We don't just take scrubs for a reason, because it's dangerous.
You really feel a part of this airplane.
It's an iconic aircraft flown by a select few. A jet that's played a pivotal role in post-war history. I'm heading to Beale Air Force Base in Northern California, home since 1976 to America's spy plane program and its longest-serving aircraft, the U-2. Less than 1,100 men and women have flown solo in the Dragon Lady. It's an exclusive club, only open to experienced pilots. And for the ones that make it, this is the ultimate flying job.
This has always been a fascination of mine, but getting into the program is a bit tricky. So I started off flying a bunch of different other airplanes, and once you gain enough experience, become an instructor in another airplane, then you get to apply to the U-2 program. We call it the brotherhood, but it's definitely this tight-knit group of people with a common focus, and that's probably the reason that people stay in this program more than any other, is the people. Every single pilot, since the very first guy that took off, we know their names. We know kind of that history, that lineage. It is a very small group of people. It's really, really cool to be a part of. I mean, what an honor to be a part of something like that.
The idea for the Angel itself was born when Lockheed started a design study on the maximum altitude possible from a jet airframe for reconnaissance purposes.
The U-2 story began more than 60 years ago, at the height of the Cold War.
This unique aircraft was originally built for the CIA back in the mid-1950s by a team of visionary engineers here in California. It was designed to do one thing, to fly extremely high and undetected behind the Iron Curtain to monitor the Soviet military threat. It was built in secret, and it was simply referred to as the Article.
The new spy plane was the brainchild of Lockheed's chief engineer, Kelly Johnson. His team worked at night, covertly assembling what they pretended was a new weather reconnaissance plane.
Here were the problems they faced: to design, build an airplane, and fly it in 8 months.
To minimise weight, the plane was fitted with just 2 wheels, the engine modified to work in the thin air of high altitude, and on board, a revolutionary camera that could capture images of Soviet missile batteries from the edge of space. As well as the CIA, the US Air Force also took delivery of this new jet, renaming it Utility Aircraft No. 2, soon to become simply the U-2. At 31 metres, the U-2's wingspan is just short of a Boeing 737 and provides the huge lift the plane needs to climb above 70,000 feet. Power comes from the same General Electric engine as the one fitted to America's B-2 stealth bomber, while dotted around the plane are dozens of electronic sensors, able to soak up vast amounts of signals and imagery, which can then be beamed back in near real time to a network of ground stations around the world. U-2 pilots are actually known as drivers. They start by qualifying on the T-38 companion trainer before they progress to a dual cockpit spy plane.
So really it's that feeling that pilot's aircraft, you're in control, hooked up to the cables that are directly hooked up to the flight controls. You can feel it, it talks to you. It's a challenge. And no matter how many hours you have in this airplane, it still finds a way to challenge you every day. And that's what keeps you coming back and keeps you going, man, I can do better. You really feel a part of this airplane.
Lieutenant Colonel Neil Hinson goes by the call sign Ping and is the chief test pilot at Beale.
Well, a lot of the earlier guys described it as like wrestling the dragon. And so what I describe it as, it's like trying to fly a dump truck with wings, right? You're carrying a load of whatever, and the airplane is just completely non-compliant a lot of the times, especially low altitude. That's a fallacy at high altitude that it doesn't fly well. It actually flies incredibly well at high altitude because that's where it's designed to fly. Initially, we want to make sure that the young students can learn to land the airplane. And as soon as they're good at landing the airplane, we take them straight to the max altitude, just so they can, familiarize themselves with the spacesuit, its function, and how the airplane behaves up at altitude. And most of the time, there's 2 things that everybody says. Number 1, the airplane flies great at altitude. It's amazing. It behaves itself really well. And the other thing is the spacesuit's a little uncomfortable at first.
Bobby Brown is a newly qualified U-2 pilot, and today he's preparing to set off for some low-level circuits. On every U-2 sortie, a second backup pilot is on hand in case the first falls ill or has a problem. They also perform another very important task, driving the chase car that helps the U-2 land safely.
852, Beal Tower, runway 33, Delta, halfway. 52, halfway, 33. 352, 13, 33, yes, Delta, ready. 3207, clear for takeoff, change approach.
We're going to give him a thumbs up, salute him, and then we'll chase him down the runway. Kind of makes you feel like Top Gear.
As the aircraft takes off, pogo wheels that support its massive wings fall away, and within seconds, the Dragon Lady is airborne.
Come on, 120. There we go.
20 minutes later, the U-2 reappears on approach for its first landing. In the chase car, the mobile officer sets off in pursuit.
On any U-2 flight, this is the most difficult moment, getting this huge jet-powered glider to come back down to Earth. So the pilot effectively has to stall the aircraft from a few feet and drop it on the runway.
6, 4, there's 3, 2, 1 inches, right rudder.
In this aircraft, the wheels behind you, you have limited visibility anyways. You put on a full pressure suit helmet, and that further restricts your vision. You have to get it right down just a couple inches above the ground and hold it right there. And as you're holding it, the airplane's changing airspeeds, which means it's pitching and it's moving. And there's all this stuff that's moving, but the whole time you have to hold that tire just a couple inches off the ground. And so that's another thing the mobile officer's helping you out with. He's watching that, making sure that critical landing of letting it stall from a few inches above the ground with that tail wheel perfectly in line. He's back there kind of coaching and guiding on that. And at the end of a long sortie, that's, it's critical to have him back there. So it's kind of this like, all right, it's game time, let's go. It's a pretty exhilarating feeling. If you ever see cockpit footage, it is full, it's just moving, working. So it's kind of, almost a gym workout every time you come back.
5, 4, 3, 2.
Not only are you fighting the plane on the way down, once he lands, there's kind of a few things to do. So you're trying to keep the plane straight and level, because obviously there's no balancing wheels. And so he's going to bring the flaps up, the speed brakes in, he's retrimming the plane. Once he does all that, then he throws the power in, and that's what you heard and felt.
After an hour of touch and goes, the sortie's over.
All right, 5-2, that is good. Brake, tower, article, and mobile are off Delta.
Mobile, Roger, you guys have a good day.
The U-2's actually designed to tip over. Titanium skids protect the wings from damage. As the aircraft comes to a stop, ground crew quickly refit the pogo wheels, allowing the jet to taxi home.
Matt, you were fine, and then I thought you were going to correct back, but you kind of kept going straight.
Well, yeah.
So it wasn't the initial turn, it was the one above.
It was two things, yeah. For whatever reason, I felt compelled to try and follow the yellow line.
Yeah.
And then I slowed down.
That looked quite athletic.
It's just tricky. It's just tricky if it's windy. Yeah. So today it wasn't unpredictable as it can be some days because the wind was pretty much constant. So, so long as you know how to account for the fact that you've got a constant crosswind, that's gonna make it imperative that you put in the crosswind control so that you're not like drifting one side or the other.
The program has not been without other casualties. One Angel crashed at Watertown.
Development of the U-2 came at a high cost. More than a dozen pilots were killed in accidents. Missions over the Soviet Union were long and dangerous. And one little-known fact is that among the men flying them were a small band of RAF pilots based in Turkey.
The British pilots, like the American pilots, they flew a lot of flights from Turkey over the Middle East. The last 5 Soviet overflights from July '59, 2 of them were flown by British pilots. And the RAF remained in the U-2 program until the CIA stopped flying it in 1974.
The first U-2 pilots were true pioneers, the astronauts of their day. No one had ever flown this high, and the survival clothing they wore was basic. Things have come a long way. Modern U-2 flight suits are made by the same company that supplies NASA. The pilots looked after by a large physiological support team.
The suit by itself is roughly about $125,000. Altogether, a fully dressed pilot's about $250,000. The suit has 12 standard sizes, and then it also comes in a 13th size, which is like the custom. So if a pilot can't fit one of our standard sizes, that we do custom fit the suit to the pilot. And he does have a pressurized cabin, but if that pressurization system were to fail, this is the only thing that's going to keep that pilot alive if he's at those higher altitudes. In the event the pilot were to lose pressurization within the aircraft, this is how firm the suit will get. And like I said, with that webbing material, it kind of keeps the pilot's arm bent if he were to bend his arm, and then if he were to flex the arm, it keeps it in that flex position.
Another life-saving item is the pilot's helmet.
Because our U-2 pilots fly high sorties, and they fly for long periods of time, we got to keep them hydrated, we got to keep them fed. So once the full pressure suit is locked down, they cannot open it again until they recover from their sortie. If by instance they were flying at the altitudes that they fly at and they were to open their helmet up to like scratch their nose, if at that instant they were to lose cabin pressure, the blood in their body would instantaneously boil and be instantaneous death. So we have our pilots, we tell them once they close down, do not open until they land. A helmet ranges about $60,000 on its own. It's very expensive because it's their last line of defense flying in the U-2. Modified water bottles, gravity fed. And it goes to their tube food there so they can drink. I also make, like to think they can scratch their nose if need be. I know if I was closed down, it'd be very, very tough not to scratch my nose.
It's like a rabbit house in there. Sort of.
It's exactly what it is. Gravity-fed hamster bottle.
With U-2 missions sometimes lasting more than 9 hours, the pilots need to eat. These fridges are stocked with what they call tube food. Everything from beef stroganoff to chocolate pudding.
It's a metal tube. This one's caffeinated apple pie. It actually has 100 milligrams of caffeine in it. And then they have other different flavors too, hot and cold options. There's actually a heater inside the aircraft that can actually heat up their beef stew or beef stroganoff or truffle mac and cheese. And even so, it's the same people that make the MREs are the ones who make the tube food itself. And then they're put in these tubes, and they'll take anywhere from 1 to 6 of them at a time, up to depending on how long their flight is.
That's got everything. That's got the pastry.
Mm-hmm.
That's got the apple,
cinnamon, nutmeg.
Yeah,
yeah,
and with caffeine. So this keeps them awake.
Yes.
Alert.
So they strategically use caffeine, whether it's like right before like a landing or something.
Yeah. So this is kind of for the end of the flight.
Yeah.
I guess.
Or whenever they need
Dessert.
it. They need a little pick me up in the middle of the flight too.
2 hours before any high flight, they pressure test everything one more time before the pilot begins the long process of suiting up.
We're in a zone that humans don't survive in. We get up there, we get above Armstrong's line. Above Armstrong's line is where the fluids in your body will actually start to boil off. And that's not ideal. So we have a lot of precautions that we take against that. So that's why we're wearing a full pressure suit, and that's to keep that from happening. So if the cockpit does depressurize, then we keep our body below Armstrong's line and keep us safe. We're getting pumped 100% oxygen into the helmet so we can breathe. But even then, you still have the physiological factors of sitting in a seat for that amount of time. Your body's so exposed to a pretty high altitude all day long as well. So it's always kind of good to have the day off after to sort of recover.
Flying at such high altitude is so physiologically demanding that U-2 pilots will usually only do it once every 4 days. They're also supposed to rest for at least 48 hours after they return. Just like astronauts, they're shuttled to their waiting jet in a vehicle nicknamed the bread van. For each of them, this is why they joined the program.
It's a lot of fun, and the reason is because nobody's perfect. And I talk to golfers. I'm not a golfer, but I talk to golfers, and the reason they like to go back and play golf is because it's so difficult to do it right. And we have the same relationship with this airplane. There are some days when I hate it. I mean, I just absolutely hate it. But then there are other days when you go out, it's a gorgeous day like today, you go fly it, and you just feel like, you know, you're the best pilot in the world because you flew the most difficult airplane. It did what it said. You know, it did what you wanted it to do, and it makes you feel good and accomplished because you know how difficult it can be to fly on those days that aren't so nice. It is a very small group of guys. We like to brag that there's more guys wearing Super Bowl rings than there are wearing U-2 solo patches. So that's something that we're pretty proud of.
Exactly how high the U-2 flies is top secret. All the US Air Force will say is that it's above 70,000 feet. But the modern U-2 jet can cover 7,000 miles without refueling.
The thrust is massive down low because you're taking in all that air. And once you get above about 50 or above 60, all of a sudden it just gets quiet and it just kind of dances up there. That experience never gets old. There's never been a time that I've been up in the U-2 and not just gone, wow, you know, just, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I get to do this. It's never lost. It's not something that loses its shine over time. You see the world in such a different way. You see it from such a different perspective than you've ever seen it before. And that will never get old.
Secret reconnaissance of Russia by high-flying American U-2 jets ended when one was downed deep in Soviet territory.
The most famous episode in U-2 history happened in 1960, when Francis Gary Powers was shot down on a mission behind the Iron Curtain.
Powers' family was in the courtroom as Russia began massive exploitation of this propaganda windfall.
Immediately he saw the flash behind him. He was very lucky. The plane began to descend. It was out of control, but he managed to get out. There was a show trial and he was sentenced to a long prison term. He wasn't tortured, he was treated relatively well, and in 1962 he was exchanged in a spy swap for a Soviet spy who had been detected and arrested in the US.
2 years later, in 1962, came another defining moment of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
Much of the evidence President Kennedy presented to the nation was captured by U-2s, and the 13-day crisis they sparked brought the US and Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. It also cost the life of a U-2 pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, shot down and killed by a Soviet missile on a mission over Cuba. Those famous photos were captured on the U-2's high-resolution camera using film specially developed by Kodak, and an updated version of that wet film camera is still in use today on the U-2.
So these are the, we call them the Versamats. These are what actually process the film that we work with. All of the film we get from the U-2s has to pass through one of these machines. And these are the same machines that we've been working with since about the 1950s. So there's a very strong potential that the film from the Cuban Missile Crisis could have gone through one of the ones in this van. Roughly 2 miles of film is run continuously through the machine. It takes roughly 9 hours. And it cannot be stopped at any time. So once we start, we have to run for 9 hours, and this is all done in the dark.
The reason why we're still using it is because the resolution is so good. It's much better than digital imagery. You could continue to zoom in for as long as you want, and you would maintain that quality much longer than you would with pixelated imagery on digital cameras.
And you're young, you're the Facebook generation, you do everything on your phones. To be working with old film, and how long does it take you to learn to do this?
It took me about, I want to say 3 or 4 months. It's all on-the-job training, so you learn as you go.
The US Air Force operates around 30 U-2s. As well as Beale, some are stationed in South Korea, others in places they don't really talk about. The jets they're flying now were built in the 1980s, but still retain the original aeroplane's straightforward design.
It's push-pull, cable-driven, everything, 100% mechanical, right.
So if you compared this to an F-35, a modern aircraft?
The only comparison that there would be was it's got wings and it flies, and other than that, there's not really much comparison.
So what's the future for the Dragon Lady? In 2005, the U-2 program was cancelled. UAVs or drones seemed to be the future. But in 2014, that was reversed. And 65 years after this aircraft first flew, it's still in operations around the world.
On the tarmac at Beale are the UAVs or drones many saw as the natural successor to the U-2, the Global Hawk. Each one cost $220 million. They carry similar sensors and have a longer range, but in other areas the U-2 still has the technological edge. So commanders have decided that for now, they'll operate them both.
A lot of people ask, why aren't satellites or drones or anybody else doing this job? And there's a really big reason. The first is, this airplane, when you compare it to a satellite, obviously we don't have to obey orbital mechanics, right? I can stand up over a location and I can be that unblinking eye for hours on end. A satellite obviously has to obey, the laws of orbit, right? And if it's a low Earth orbit, you might get a stare at a certain location for 15 to 20 seconds, and that's it. Whereas compare that to my 10 plus hours being on station. The other thing is I can incorporate all different kinds of things into my payload really quickly for a low cost. A satellite, just to get it into orbit, it's incredibly expensive. There are other capabilities out there that are maybe 80% there, but what the combatant commanders have repeatedly said is 80% of the U-2 is still not a replacement for the U-2.
The U-2 flew extensively over Afghanistan and over Iraq during both the Gulf Wars, and has flown more recently over Syria. It's getting a picture that sensors on aircraft at a lower level cannot achieve. They are moving very fast if they're a fighter, or very close to the ground if they're an attack helicopter. And they are equipped with very good sensors, but they can't dwell in the way that a U-2 can. A typical U-2 mission might involve a racetrack pattern offshore from a country so that they can remain in an area of interest, and they might have to wait for instance, a missile site to start emitting. It's that kind of capability that the U-2 uniquely offers.
But with that capability comes danger. Since the 1990s, 6 U-2 pilots have been killed, most recently Lieutenant Colonel Steve Eady. A father of 6 with 20 years experience, Shooter, as he was known, died in a training accident near Beale in 2016.
We always wear mementos and remember those that came before us, and a lot of times the lessons that they learned we just didn't know. We pay close attention to the rules, especially the rules that are written in blood that our comrades learned, unfortunately, the hard way. And that's the way our flight manual is written. And a lot of us that have been in the program for a long time, we know the verbiage that's been put into our flight manual because of the accidents that have happened in the past.
Inside Beale, an original U-2 stands as a reminder of just how long this famous spy plane has been around. For now, it seems she'll be flying well into the next decade. And despite the dangers, these pilots will tell you this remains the greatest job in the world. The chance to live out the U-2 motto, soaring to the edge of space, alone, unarmed, and unafraid. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.